Hello, good evening, everybody. Welcome to a Saturday show. We don't normally do a Saturday show, but it's good to see you here. And today we are going to be discussing the Sensible Centre. It is all the rage at the moment on Twitter. It has momentum. It is inevitable. The Sensible Centre. This is going to be the first of what I'm calling Amazing Advent. In the run up to Advent, I'm going to be doing 3 streams a week: Monday, Tuesday, and Saturday. It's trying something a bit different for myself, and I can't think of a better topic to start, to be honest. And if you want more content like this in the future, make sure to like and subscribe, and send in super chat, become a member, support the channel. It'd be great. We have lots of things going ahead. I think on Monday I'm on with Praise of Folly, discussing the Lord of the Rings. Then on Tuesday, discussing the Lord of the Rings again with a very special couple of people. One of them is
Now, say my name.
Apostolic Majesty,
You're goddamn right.
and the other, of course.
That was what they used to call me.
Yes, brilliant video editing there. I'm sure you could agree. But yes, on Tuesday, we're going to be. I'm going to be joined by Apostolic Majesty and Black Horse. It's a very great privilege for me, and we're going to be discussing the adaptations of the Lord of the Rings into films by Peter Jackson. We've just had the Rings of Power universally panned as very poor adaptations of the material, but I thought 20 years have passed. And maybe it's time to evaluate the Lord of the Rings films and see, try and pierce through the nostalgia and some of maybe the over glamorization of it, and say, okay, what was good about it and what was bad, and we'll explore that. So that's all for next week. But in the meantime, we have the Sensible Centre. And really, this topic has emerged since Elon Musk has bought Twitter. With him buying Twitter, he's a big advocate of freedom of speech. And so he has released a lot of accounts which have been banned for mainly political reasons, for saying things which would be deemed as hate speech or offensive in the liberal paradigm. And so many of these accounts have come back, such as Carl Benjamin, Sargon of Akkad. And this has kind of given a swell of optimism amongst the right, and let's just say the distant right in general, that people feel this is a victory. This used to be a castle, a node of propaganda for the regime where they could just censor those who spread information which was detrimental to it. And it's now been secured against it by somebody who is allowing such information to flow once more. And so this is an opportunity. This is a time in which there is great potential to use Twitter in a meaningful way to advance our interests. We have the freedom to do that, as long as we're not promoting violence or something of that kind, which Musk will ban. Then there is open ground. And so we need to utilize that. And a couple of folks within our sphere, primarily Academic Agent and Carl Benjamin, have been pushing this idea of the Sensible Centre, that we should rebrand. We're no longer the dissident right. We shouldn't call ourselves that. We should call ourselves the Sensible Centre, and we should frame our ideas, our policy proposals, our vision of what society should look like as not as a dissident right, not as reactionary, not even as conservative, but rather as sensible policies from the centre. And there has been a great back and forth over this. I was watching the Distributist the other day, gave a very good response to this. And there have been others as well who have raised, well, many have kind of agreed in general that this is a good idea, that they feel it's just the sort of thing that they needed for things to click into place. Others have felt that there are various problems with it. I think one thing that I want to mention right from the off with it is that we've just seen the debacle with Alex Jones and Kanye West, and with Nick Fuentes as well, and Milo, and this whole kind of a very how would you put it? They are seen as the alternative right and the embodiment of white nationalism within our current context, and their antics are rejected by almost everybody. What Kanye was saying on that podcast has had no positive reaction. And so part of the strength of the Sensible Centre is it distances serious people from those sorts of individuals who are just going to say outrageous things, whose association with is going to drag you down, as has been tried with Trump. You know, they had dinner with Trump, and that's been used to tar him. And so there is this sense that we need to distinguish ourselves from these bad faith actors, these individuals who are not serious, who seem absurd to not necessarily the populace, although they do, but the people that we want to try to persuade. We don't, and when I say persuade, I don't mean that in a democratic sense. I mean, we want to get elite individuals, people with talent, people perhaps with some degree of power. In other words, we want non-governing elites, folks who are not, who do have some ability, who could rule, but are not within the ruling center, because those are the sorts of people who could, if there was a regime change, if there was a circulation of elites, could end up in those seats, right? That's who we want on our side, or we want to become one with them or part of them, or something like that. We're not going to do that if we're seen as allied with Nick Fuentes, right? Certainly not after the last debacle. So I think you can see that there is a desire then to find a new identity, which is away from dissident right. And this isn't just something that's just popped into the air. I think some people seem to think it's just a reaction to the current moment. But over the last year or so, we've had constant debates concerning who belongs to the dissident right, who's allowed in, who's not. What things do you need to believe to be a member of the dissident right? And all of these things are these debates, these discussions, these tensions emerge, I think, in part because none of us are comfortable with the label, in part because it doesn't truly describe any particular group. It's an umbrella for so many points of view that it's almost meaningless. And in turn, that means that you want to, or many of us want to, assert who we are and define the DR by kind of what we want. So it's not a particularly helpful label. It's rather just a broad coalition of all those who are not welcome in the mainstream discourse at the moment. That's no great label for asserting your values or for changing the situation. And so, given the lack of use with this label and the tensions that have already emerged within it, people wondering whether certain points of view are too liberal and so on, or useful, or etc., etc. This is just kind of the icing on the cake. This is just one proposal for how we move away from it, and how we just maybe draw a fault line with some people moving to this new brand and others staying, and it might help to winnow out or provide a clearer sense of who's within which place. What I want to do in this stream, in the first part, is kind of take a little bit of a different approach to the Sensible Centre. There's been a lot of discussion on the kind of purely political level and the kind of practicalities of it. How well does it characterize our current situation? How likely is it to succeed? I want to approach it from a philosophical point of view. Indeed, the history of the idea of the centre, or the sensible centre, we might say, and how this is a long tradition within Western philosophy, and culture about how we understand the world. And when we get that, when we kind of appreciate the concept of the sensible center having this long root, which many of us just take for granted, we might be able to see more clearly the political utility of branding ourselves in this way, or at least part of it, of branding ourselves as the center. We'll then maybe look at a few questions I have for those who propose this, the sensible center, some things which I think are problems perhaps for it, dangers, pitfalls. Not that they're necessarily irredeemable or can't be addressed, but things that I think need working out a bit more if this is going to succeed. I want to say, though, in general, I'm very appreciative of those who've come up with this. They're coming up with something, right? Not many people are. It's an original idea. And I think, I hope that what I say is taken in good faith and charitably, and it's not meant to be an attack on a person, but rather a discussion of the ideas. So without further ado, I've even come up with a presentation today. I'm not normally one for that, but I've tried to make it a little bit more professional today. Let's see. So yes, the Sensible Center, history and analysis. And so to start with, I want to begin with Aristotle. For Aristotle, human nature is teleological. That means that, well, he would say all things are teleological. All being is constituted insofar as it's a system of properties or a collection of properties which together have an end goal or an ultimate purpose. And for human beings, for Aristotle, in his book, The Ethics, he defines the purpose of human life is to achieve the good or to be good. So this begs the question, how does an individual be good? And he defines it in book 2 in the following way, which is to have virtue. What is virtue? It is to have the right feelings at the right times, on the right grounds, towards the right people, for the right motive, and in the right way, is to feel them to an intermediate, that is to the best degree, and this is the mark of virtue. So for Aristotle, a virtue consists in an attitude, you might say. It is an ability to respond to a situation emotionally, intellectually, and behaviorally in a way that's appropriate. So if I see a wolf coming towards me, I feel the right emotion, i.e. fear, and I have the right action. I run or I fight, depending on whether it's appropriate. And that is the characteristic of virtue. How then do you know which is the right feeling or thought that you might have? Well, Aristotle has this interesting idea, the doctrine of the mean. He points out that if you take, say, a line, if you divide it in half and there's equal parts, you will have the midpoint, the mean. And anything kind of either side of it is either excessive or deficient. So he says if you needed a certain number of things, but 10 is too many and 2 is too few, 6 is the mean between them. That's the golden mean. So that's the rational thing you ought to take. Now, when it comes to creatures, you can't divide in that way. Rather, it's the mean relative to us. So if we talk about diet, for example, a normal person has to take a certain amount of calories each day. If they take too little, they will be hungry and not receive the nutrition they need and grow weaker and ill. If they eat too much, they will become obese and have similar heart problems and so on. What they need then is to have the mean. But this is relative to the individual, because a normal person will need much less in the way of calories than an athlete an athlete needs a huge appetite. So what would be excessive for the normal person would be the mean, the rational mean for the athlete. So the mean is proportionate, right? It's proportionate to the individual and the function that they have. So when we turn to the question of being good rather than, your food, the mean lies between two vices: a deficiency in feeling, thought, and behavior, and an excess in feeling, thought, and behavior. And this is seen in this definition that I've got here. Virtue is a purposive disposition. That is a behavioral attitude. It might be conscious or unconscious, lying in a mean, so in the midpoint, that is relative to us and determined by a rational principle, and by that a prudent man would use to determine it. And Aristotle very helpfully put together a table of vices and virtues. So let's just do a couple of these. So we can see here that there is a scale between cowardice, courage, and rashness. Now, cowardice would be clearly the deficiency here. You're faced with a dangerous situation, and instead of doing your duty, you feel overwrought with fear and run away and hide when your duty was to stay and fight. That's clearly a vice. At the other end, though, is being overbold, that you stand and fight against something which you ought to run away from. You're faced with an alpha gorilla, which you've got no chance of slaying, and instead of running while you've got the chance, you charge towards it. That's clearly a vice as well. That's excessive courage. But the virtuous mean between these two, between cowardice and rashness, is courage. It is doing the right thing, standing up at the right time, in the right way, to the right amount, where you can. If we look to the next one, so this is to do, we might say, with pleasures, our indulgence of pleasures. Often the Puritan is characterized as somebody who is insensible. They do not enjoy life. They do not take on pleasurable activities like going to the theatre. They try to ban these. On the other hand, you've got the intemperate, the what would you call it? Licentious, perhaps? A libertine, that's the word I'm looking for. Somebody who just indulges all their senses and just gorges on pleasure, even when it's wrong, when it's illicit. We might say a very extreme example would be somebody who enjoys killing other people or torturing other people. That's clearly intemperate. Just because they enjoy it doesn't mean they should do it. So between the cold hard Puritan, or the stereotype at least, and the libertine, we have the temperate, the person who enjoys the good things in life, but to a reasonable degree. It doesn't dominate who they are. They are able to conduct themselves and not be mastered by those things they enjoy. They're not addicted to them, but they do enjoy the good things in life. And you could do the same with a number of these virtues and vices. But the key thing here, I think, for Aristotle, and the thing that I want us to begin with here, is we can see that in Aristotle's view, human flourishing, the best way to fulfill human life is to find in your thoughts and feelings and behaviors the center or the midpoint between deficiency and excess. The two extremes are bad and the center ground is good. Now, Aristotle's ideas were adapted and reformulated and modified by the Stoics, Augustine, the medieval Catholic tradition, until we find a kind of synthesis with Thomas Aquinas's theory of the passions. And this came to be the dominant understanding of what we would call emotions, although it is a bit different, up until the Enlightenment. Or, it went through modifications, that people took their own slants on it, but in general, Aquinas's understanding of the passions was the main way medieval and early modern folks understood their felt what they felt. And for Aquinas, a passion is first triggered by an object. With our senses, our sight, smell, taste, touch, hearing, we apprehend something and we, in a sense, receive it into ourselves. This isn't a representational theory of knowledge. We literally receive the form of the thing into ourselves. And as we do so, we make an instinctive judgment about it. We apprehend or evaluate whether this thing is good or bad for me. So a sheep wandering in the field looks up and sees a wolf. This is Aquinas's description. And as he sees the wolf, he recognizes or judges, not in a conscious way, but just as an intuition, this wolf will harm me. So the sheep has a certain reaction to this. Its appetite, or what Aquinas would call its sensitive appetite, those instinctual urges or impulses that we have, for the sheep, it would either move towards or away from the object it apprehends, tied to the fact of whether it's good or bad. We move towards things which are good for us. We want them. We want to unite with them and have them. We move away from things which are bad for us. We want to get away from them. We don't want to be harmed from them. So in the case of the sheep, it feels a pull away, we might say. And in turn, this motivates its behavior. It then runs away. You feel the fear and you run. You don't think about it. Humans, it's a very similar process. And for Aquinas, there are different movements. So, and do I have it here? Yes. So this is the Stoic kind of definition of the four passions. But for Augustine, kind of changed this a little bit. He understood that the fundamental passion is love. That you have an inclination towards an object that you believe is or think is good for you. And once you have this love for an object, it automatically becomes appetite or desire. You can see that here, right? Appetite, an impulse towards something in the future that is considered good. But you don't have it yet. And then when you get it, when your appetite rests in the object, this is pleasure or joy, an impulse towards something present now that is considered good. By contrast, if something is an obstacle to your love or against what you love, you hate it. You have an evil inclination towards it. And in turn, you will be feared of it or averse to it. So your appetite will want to move away from it. And if it catches up with you, if you are actually harmed by the wolf, you will be in distress or sorrow. So you can see that there's a clear origin of all the passions for Augustine, and I think for Aquinas really, in the passion of love. What you love, I guess, orders your responses in all other ways. You could put it that way. What you can see then is that there is this idea of motion for Aquinas. He applies Aristotle's concept of change as motion as a form of change, his analysis of that, and applies it to the inner workings of our souls and bodies. And as a consequence, we can say that there are two ways in which a passion can be morally wrong. You can have the wrong passion in response to an object. So say there is a golden idol before me, the golden calf, right? And I should hate this thing. It is idolatrous. But I have an instinctive response that I think this thing is good for me, that it will give me all the things I want, and so I love it. That's clearly wrong. That's a wrong passion. I was moved in the wrong way. I should have moved away from my appetite should have moved away from it. Instead, it went towards it. But there is another way in which my passions can be wrong. I can have the right passion in response to an object, but I can have it too little or too much. I can have it deficiently or excessively. Say there is, yeah, I like chocolate, right? Yeah, I love chocolate, particularly dairy milk, partly because I used to live next to the Cadbury's chocolate factory in Birmingham. I could smell it in the morning on the air. It was great. And I I love this too much, so much so that I will gorge myself on chocolate. That is a case where I'm loving it too much. On the other hand, we could say for many Christians have the experience that although they want to love God, they love God too little, deficiently, not enough. So you can see then that there is a mean in terms of the way our appetites move. They need to move towards the and away from the right objects and to the right proportion. We could then also see this in a physical manifestation. For Aquinas, let me kind of introduce this bit with an example because it's a bit alien to modern ways of thinking about the body. Aquinas famously said that anger is the blood boiling. Sure, many of you will have heard this phrase. You're boiling my blood, you know. But for these people, this isn't just a flowery metaphor. They actually believed this is what's happening when you're angry. And this is because they didn't think of kind of causation as necessarily a chain, as we do, a kind of Newtonian chain, but rather that multiple events can take place, or we might say an event can take place on multiple spheres. So something can be happening spiritually, which is manifested physically, and they're not kind of one and then the other. They are manifestations of the same thing in two different planes together. They're intertwined. Owen Barfield would call this original participation. So on the spiritual level, or the immaterial level, the movement of your appetite is taking place towards or away from the object. On a physiological level, what's happening involves the blood. Now, they didn't have the same understanding of the human body as we do. It wouldn't be until William Harvey in 1617, I want to say, that the idea of the circulation of the blood through the veins was really kind of put forward in mainstream discourse. Before that point, there was this idea, both at an academic and a popular level, that the blood is really pushed in and out by the heart. The heart dilates and the blood is pushed outwards from the heart through the body. And then when it contracts, all the blood goes back towards the heart. And these motions of the heart are tied to the motions of the appetite. So when you feel desire, your appetite moves towards the object which you desire, and the heart dilates, and the blood is sent forth to the extremities of the body. And when you have that object, it's even more so, so you're feeling joy. By contrast, when you want to move away from an object, when your appetite declines away, then the heart contracts, goes back in on itself, and the blood recedes to the heart. And so you have this dynamic of it being manifested on a physical level. And so just like the motion of the appetite can be excessive or deficient, so too can the motion of the heart and thus the motion of the blood be excessive or deficient. And this could have serious consequences. There was great fear that if the blood shot out from the heart too quickly and too fast, that your heart would be left with no heat, which was carried within the blood, and you would die. Or if the blood receded too quickly back to the heart, then it would choke the heart. The rest of your body would be far too cold, and you would die. So an excessive or a deficient passion could kill you. So it's not just on a moral level that it's dangerous. On a physiological level, it is critical that you have the right amount. And this is tied to the idea of the four humours. Many of you will have come across this. It emerges with Hippocrates, where we get the Hippocratic Oath from. It's discussed by Galen, and it really is a mainstay up until the Enlightenment as an understanding of the human body. The idea is that within our blood, there are four elements mixed together. There is blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. And these have different properties. Blood is hot and wet. Yellow bile is hot and dry. Phlegm is wet and cold. And black bile is cold and dry. And together, these humours, I should say, are manifestations within the body of the four elements which make the material world: air, fire, earth, and water. And they share the respective properties, as you can see on this diagram. Now, what's crucial is that you need the four humours conjoined together in a proportionate mixture. That although one will always dominate over the others, it needs to be in a certain balance. Because in their mind, in their worldview, the two things needed for life are heat and moisture. But if one becomes too strong, you eradicate the other. So if your body is too dry, then you're not getting enough moisture and you will die. However, if it's too cold and wet, then you don't have enough heat and you will die. So you need a balance of the two things. You cannot have one excessively or deficiently. It will kill you. And these balances within our blood change depending on our circumstances. Our age affects it. Different ages were expected to have different compositions of these, as well as sex. So I think men were tended to be were judged to be more sanguinian, whereas women were more likely to be phlegmatic and melancholic, that is, have too much black bile in their blood. Ethnicity was a factor, climate, the seasons, diet, and just the weather of the day would make a difference. And then each individual would have their own balances. Now, if you think about this, what we've said about the passions, and what we've said about the humours, you will be able to see that the humours, your humoral balance, will have an impact upon your passions, your ability to feel rightly and wrongly. Because if you remember, our passions, the way we feel, what we feel is our blood circulating around the body or retracting, and that modulates the temperature of our body. So the blood goes out to the extremities and I feel warmer, and that's the experience of pleasure. Retreats in, that's the feeling of pain. So it's the modulation of temperature, which is the experience of the passions for the medieval early modern mindset. Well, then if you have a certain humoral balance, so let's say you have a balance which is dominated by blood, so it's hot and wet, well then you're going to feel more joyful more of the time, and your heart will be able to dilate more freely. However, if you've got a melancholic disposition, that is one which has black bile more than the others, then you're going to be colder and drier. So you're going to be less able for your heart to dilate and spread the blood further. You're not going to rise in temperature as quickly. Now, that isn't necessarily a bad thing if it's proportionate. So you can see that in this sort of mindset, you need to be at the midpoint in terms of your humoral balance, in terms of the movements of your passions, that you need, and then that has an impact upon your behavior and the moral worth of it. That also has to be at the midpoint. So all the way through the human being at a physical level, at a moral level, at spiritual level, all has to be aligned to the mean or the midpoint. Any deficiency or excess causes vice and ill health and eventually death. So it is critical you sit on that midpoint in the early modern mindset. It is the key to well-being in all senses, not just a material sense. And each one impacts the other. I think that's the key point for these people. If it goes wrong on one place, if you're if physically you're not at the midpoint, then it's going to knock everything else off. You're not going to be able to feel or have the passions to the right level. They're going to be deficient or excessive too. Likewise, if you have a deficient or excessive passion, you're also going to have a deficient or excessive physical state. So you see it. You see it's quite an issue. I've been mentioning proportionality a lot so far, and this idea really has its roots in Vitruvius, the Roman architect, and he defined beauty in this way. Architecture consists of order, which in Greek is called taxis, and arrangement, which the Greeks name diathesis, and of proportion and symmetry and decor and distribution, which in the Greeks is called oikonomia. Order is the balanced adjustment of the details of the work separately, and as to the whole, the arrangement of the proportion with a view to a symmetrical result. Proportion implies a graceful semblance, the suitable display of details in their context. This is attained when the details of the work are of a height suitable to their breadth, of a breadth suitable to their length. In a word, when everything has a symmetrical correspondence. Symmetry also is the appropriate harmony arising out of the details of the work itself, the correspondence of each given detail to the form of the design as a whole. As in the human body, from cubit, foot, palm, inch, and other small parts, come the symmetric quality of eurythmy. You'll have to forgive my Greek pronunciation there. The idea then of proportionality is symmetry, that one half looks identical to the other half. And so this very clearly relates to the idea of the golden mean, or the mean running through our health. The balance of our humors ought to have a certain symmetry to it. If one is deficient or excessive, then it's no longer symmetrical. You could say the same with our passions, and by extent, then our dispositions. And thus, whether a vice is a disposition which is deficient or excessive, so there's no longer that symmetry within our moral selves. And what's interesting then is we've connected this with the physical world too, and its appearance. So beauty is itself in the classical conception, tied to the center ground or the middle, because the middle is that which equally divides the two parts, thus making them symmetrical. We can see this with Da Vinci's The Vitruvian Man, and I think, it's inspired by that passage we've just seen. You can see that he is perfectly symmetrical, that his form, there is no blemish here, that it concurs, it has an order to it which is perfect. And this ought to be reflected in our architecture too. That's why I often think when we see these horrible buildings today, which try to be outrageous, which have these deformities on them, they're clearly deficient or excessive in some way or another. we respond with a natural disgust because we recognize there's not that symmetry there, which indicates proportion and thus beauty. It's also why, if you look at classic Disney films, the villains tend to have some kind of deformity or lack of pleasing symmetricality to their faces, whereas the heroes always seem to have a good symmetry in their appearance. So that's a very so we can see that in the pre-modern point of view, the moral, spiritual, physiological, architectural, and physical all relate to the same principle, and an imbalance in one leads to an imbalance in all. And I think this is connected further to the concept of the music of the spheres. The term itself comes from the Christian philosopher Boethius, but he was very much inspired by Pythagorean thought. Pythagoras thought that the planets and the stars exist within certain proportions to one another, and it is within these proportions that they move together in a sort of concordant order. And he recognized that certain proportions are can be mapped mathematically, and this also applies to music. So when you play a guitar, for example, your hands go on the strings, and doing so, they create certain proportions, which, of the length of strings, and this then produces certain notes. And together, certain proportions are more pleasing to the ear than others. Those are the ones which are the right proportions. You might say the symmetrical proportions, in contrast to those which cause disharmony. Now, Pythagoras reckoned that the spheres moved in such a proportion to one another, the planets are in motion in proportion to one another, that they create harmony, that it is a beautiful order. And in the same way, music can have an impact upon our souls. Remember, our souls move towards and away an object, and this is the cause of a passion. So when we hear a piece of music, if it is harmonious and it can represent a certain set of passions in music itself in a sonic form, pitch being a motion vertically, rhythm motion horizontally, through time, we might say. And in so doing, we become attuned, we move, our souls imitate the movement of the music within us as a passion. So harmonious music attunes us to the music of the spheres, and there is cosmological and harmony with our souls. But music which is disharmony, which clashes, or is of a certain kind which is not conducive, that takes us out of balance. It gives us the wrong passions to the wrong degree, and thus we are no longer within harmony with the universe and the cosmos. So again, that right proportion, the golden mean, is critical to having harmony within ourselves and by extension with the universe. And there is this idea, the axis mundi, the pillar or the center of the world. This idea that, well, if we go back to the previous slide, you can see here's the Earth, Terra, and there is this axis here, the axis on which all the planets go around, the celestial globe, as it were. And this is the center point of the Earth and of the rotation. And there was this, and you can see a representation here from the endless column. And there is this sense in which the monarch or the sovereign of a people stands at this point. that they become the embodiment of the axis mundi. And without this figure, or if this figure isn't there, the individual, social, and cosmological order break down and chaos enters in. There is a story from Celtic Ireland, and one day I hope to do a stream on the Irish Celts and their mythology. I think that would be really interesting. They very much had this idea of the king standing for the natural, social, and cosmological order. And they believed that a king who ruled in truth was able to uphold the center of the universe. A 6th century legend about the kings of Connacht, which I think is in the southwest of Ireland, but I could be totally wrong about that. At Tara, the royal palace there, a usurper called, and you're going to have to forgive again my terrible pronunciation here, Locaid Mac Con, he started giving false judgments. He started to give deceitful decisions, all for his own interest. And as that happened, the walls of the royal palace started to crumble. However, when the true king, Cormac Mac Ert, gave a wise and true judgment, when he returned to the throne and gave truthful and honest decisions, the wall of the palace steadied of its own accord. And this concords with an early Irish poem that declares, "A ruler's truth is an effort which overpowers armies. It brings milk into the world. It brings corn and mast." So there is this sense that if there is a true ruler, if there is somebody who's meant to be in that position, I guess has been appointed by the gods or by the natural law, then we have order and harmony. But if you remove the center point, then all descends into deficiency or excess. We see this in Shakespeare. The character of King Lear is deposed by his children, his daughters. So you have this male king who's by right is to rule, who is usurped by his, the feminine, so that the insubordinate, those who should be subordinate in, a Shakespearean worldview, while he is still alive, and he is driven mad. He goes running out onto the heath during a storm, so we have cosmological disorder here, and eventually it breeds war, that this is all going to come together. Or again with Henry IV, who usurped the rightful king, Richard II. He plunges the realm into civil war. His reign is plagued by civil war. His son, Hal, has abandoned the royal duties he ought to have and spends his time drinking in the tavern with lowlifes and scum and villainy. And he himself becomes a melancholic character. He is plagued by worries and anxieties and stress. Heavy lies the crown, as is famously said in Henry IV, Part 1, I want to say. Heavy is the head that wears the crown, or bears the crown. I've butchered the quotation. You get the point. At all levels, the wrong person is the sovereign, and in turn, all levels of order break apart. If we move forward then to the Elizabethan era, Queen Elizabeth I, she employed this idea called the middle way, the via media. And this was really an ecclesiastical policy that she pursued. Recognizing that she had just come off the back of her sister's reign, Mary I, who was a Roman Catholic, who had executed many Protestants, Elizabeth recognized that on the one hand, she wanted to bring in a Protestant regime, but she didn't want to alienate all of the Catholics in the country, which was a sizable proportion, not least because there was always the threat that if she did so, Catholic powers like the Spanish might try to invade and use the native Catholics as an internal source of disruption and subterfuge. and subversion. So she channeled a middle way where, on the one hand, you had the excesses of Catholicism, superstition, and so on, as they would call it. On the other hand, you had the Puritans who were zealous and wanted constant reform. And in the middle way, you had a kind of broad Anglicanism, which wasn't doctrinally demanding, providing one attended parish worship. As long as one did that, one was okay. But if you were advocating for the return of Catholicism or for Puritan reform, the two extremes, you were in a bad position. You needed to follow the middle way. And this idea of moderation was both then it worked on two levels: moderation of the inward self, restraining one's passions, right, to the middle ground or to the mean, but also the government, church authorities, moderating the behavior of those under their charge. Moderation thus has this continuum of the personal and the social. The two are bound together. And if one's passions are over the top or going beyond one's place, then the authorities had the right to moderate you through discipline. And I've done a video on that in the past, so I won't go into all of that now. These ideas get developed further by individuals such as Robert Burton, who you can see here on the right, in his famous 1621 treatise, The Anatomy of Melancholy, which is a goldmine for historians of the passions and emotions. Burton was trying to give a medical account of this condition. I've already mentioned that black bile, the dominance of black bile in the humans, would be understood as the temperament of melancholy, a proneness to maybe sadness or quietness and seriousness. It could be the spark of genius, but when it became excessive in the blood, it produced this condition of melancholy, which led people to terror, despair, suicide. You get the picture. And there was an epidemic of this during the 17th century. He sought to try and provide remedies for this, but he also wanted to put forward his Anglican faith. He believed that this was the true faith and the middle way between Catholicism and Puritanism. And he argued that both the Catholic mystic and the Puritan zealot are motivated by melancholy, that actually their religious experiences are not from the divine, but rather from this illness. They have too much black bile in their blood. This has caused them to have anxieties and terrors, maybe even ecstasies. And then the preachers, the Puritan preacher comes along, preaches damnation and the wrath of God. This exacerbates your illness further. It intensifies the black bile in your blood. And so you look for them for relief. They give you certain promises, assurances of salvation if you believe. But in turn, you're in this cycle of dependency on the preacher, who then returns again by stoking up terror within you. So you get progressively worse and worse. So these Puritans who are advocating for reform, where it's coming from, their zeal to ban the theatre, ban musicians on a Sunday, to abolish Christmas, it's coming, in his view, from an excess in the blood, which is a form of illness. And so this whole political project is by the unhealthy. That is, those who are not in the middle way, those who are not healthy. And so you can see what he's done here. We've already had this sense that the middle way is healthy and deficiency and excess is illness. He's then applied that to the political spectrum. He's pathologized his political enemies. Those on the extremes are also those who are motivated by, and by extremes in terms of their views and also their health, are motivated by ill health. It's very clever. So we can then dismiss what they have to say as the ramblings of those who are insane or unwell. And what they need is not to be, we shouldn't embrace what they say. Rather, we need to give them treatment, proper treatment. And that is the middle way of moderating the passions and through high Anglicanism. This then gets carried over into the Civil War period and further into the Restoration. And you have individuals like Edward Stillingfleet and William Chillingworth who very much follow Burton's approach. They argue that Christianity consists in the scriptures alone, that is the authority, as interpreted by reason, that everything within the scriptures can be understood by the common reason, and it should accord with reason. Anything which doesn't is not part of biblical revelation. You could call this a kind of common sense reading of the Bible being advocated here. By contrast, in their view, the Catholic mystic, like Teresa of Avila, and the Puritan zealot, they don't rely on scripture alone. Rather, they rely on experiences of the divine in their lives. This is particularly the case in the English Civil War, where you start to see the emergence of radical Puritan groups, such as the Fifth Monarchists, who placed a heavy emphasis upon prophecy. Figures like Anna Trapnell emerging, claiming to have received revelations and visions from God, who are able to thus give instruction to their followers as to what they should do and campaign for on a political front. The Fifth Monarchists place the authority of these prophecies very highly, and they start telling people like Oliver Cromwell what they should be doing, how they should run the country, based on these things. And they interpret scripture based on their experiences of God's presence. Now, this, I think the opponents here, like Chillingworth and Stillingfleet, are being a little bit ungenerous here, uncharitable, because for the mainstream Puritan, yes, there is an emphasis on experience, but in their view, it's an experience of the truth of the scriptures. That the doctrines are not just things they know, but they are in some sense alive to them. They feel their truth. That's what they're looking for. But nonetheless, there were these radical groups who said, put their emphasis upon revelation from God via prophecy, or in the case of the Quakers, via the inner light that all men possess, all men and women. And thus we should listen to that because it's of an equal standing to the scriptures. Let's see. Yes, we have the Fifth Monarchists here with Thomas Venner being satirized in this picture. The Fifth Monarchists, and I did a little video on them, they believe, I've been mentioning that they had this emphasis on prophecy, private religious experience being authoritative, and they persuaded Cromwell to try and establish a rule of the saints, that selected churches, congregational churches, would have permission or should form parliament. This was after the execution of the king, and these saints would rule until, preparing the way for Christ to return as the fifth monarch from the book of Daniel. The bare bones parliament, it started, Cromwell listened to their advice, and it was an absolute disaster, and nothing got done. So Cromwell disbanded it, and the Fifth Monarchist went from seeing him as the new Gideon to actually being the Antichrist. This was one of the prophecies of Anna Trapnell. And so they, just at the turn when Charles II was restored to the throne, some of them, led by this man, Thomas Venner, tried to instigate a revolution, to institute the rule of the saints. 50 men tried to conquer London, which at that time I believe would have had would it be 500,000 to perhaps? I've seen different figures, but at least 500,000 people. But nonetheless, the fifth monarchists, because of their faith, tried to capture London by force. They managed to be on the run for a couple of days. They pushed back the local militia, but in the end, they were all killed off. And Charles II used this as a pretext to ban all religious groups which he deemed a threat to national security, including the Quakers and Baptists. It was a monumental mistake by the fifth monarchists, if it was, in terms of religious toleration. But the point that I want to get to here, because that might seem a little bit of a tangent, the rationalists that I've been mentioning, Stillingfleet and Chillingworth and their ilk, they believed that enthusiasm, which was a trust in private religious experience as authoritative, was the cause of violence within the Civil War. That by trusting in your private experience, this is not something that I can experience necessarily. And so while some people will believe an individual's kind of prophecies and testimonies, others won't. As a consequence, there will be disagreement. And the only way to bring people to your point of view is through force. Thus, the disagreements produce violence. So these people are to blame for the Civil War. By contrast, a religion based on reason, so interpreting the Bible using reason, not private experience, that is the way towards a peaceful society, an ordered society, because in their view, all people share this common reason. And so we can be persuaded to the right conclusions about reality. And you kind of see this idea taken up by John Locke as well, towards the end of the 17th century. So the middle ground is rational, it is sensible, in contrast to the extreme, which, because it relies on information which is not objective and thus universal, brings about disharmony. And moreover, this stuff that they're engaged in, these experiences that they're basing themselves in or trusting in, are the product of illness. So before we get to the next slide, we can see then from this kind of survey of the center, or the sensible center history, as I'm calling it, we have this idea of the mean, which runs through all things, and that conformity to the mean sets the world in its proper way, in flourishing, because it is harmonious. The personal, the social, and the natural are all in harmony and congruence. Any deficiency or excessiveness, going beyond the mean either way, is the cause of illness, vice, social breakdown, anarchy, war, and then on a natural level, disease, famine, flood. You get the picture. It's only when these things are fully aligned on the mean that there is paradise. And so the moderate Anglicans, their genius was saying, we are the middle. We are the middle way. They literally define themselves that way. We are moderate in our passions. We moderated them to the golden mean, Aristotelian virtue. And this is translated into our social arrangement, where we have a king who is not tyrannous, but is also not allowing for anarchy. He rules so that society is in a middle way. And those who oppose us, the Catholics and the Puritans, they have an excessive in their or a deficient health, and this is causing their excessive zeal in politics, which is causing social fragmentation. So the center ground is the place you want to be. It's healthy, it's well-being, and it's peace. The extremes are mentally deranged, they are ill, and they are the cause of war. And it's my view that in part this is why people hate the Puritans so much in our society, that they see them as these sorts of figures as defined from the center, from the moderates, as they're often called. But it's also why we see the political spectrum in the way we do, at least in an Anglo context. That because we have this kind of framework, which has very much been carried on through the centuries, that sees the Puritans as these extreme, both in their health and in their views, and as social disruptors, that they are to be shunned. Whereas the kind of rational religion, which gives birth to the Enlightenment in terms of rationalism and empiricism, I mentioned John Locke, right? That is the place where we want to be, because it doesn't produce war and it's healthy. And so I've kind of put these 2 points here. On the first hand, it's in accordance with natural law, insofar as it fulfills our teleology. To be virtuous is to have a moderate disposition to action. It is in accordance then with the axis mundi. The cosmological order is also proportionate, and with the social order. And when these three are tied together along the mean, there is flourishing. Deficiency and excess is a abandonment of natural law. And in turn, this means that it's healthy, and so it is also rational, and vice versa. Because it's rational, it is healthy. Extremists at either end lead to disorder in the self, lead to unhappy people, lead to a dysfunctioning society, and a broken cosmos. And we need to realign on all of these fronts. Now, I don't need to put the point too much at length, but aren't we in this society in a place of disorder? The number of people who need mental health help in our society is going through the roof. The number of young men who are committing suicide is terrible. The number of people who are in Canada going through euthanasia is awful. The amount of people who even if we get move away from the mental health aspect, who are just suffering internally, who are unfulfilled in their lives, it's a huge problem. And then on a social level, we're more fragmented than before. We're seeing communities which have lived in places for hundreds of years totally disrupted and forced out of their homes by capitalism, by the state, by mass migration. We're seeing people getting poorer than their parents. We're seeing systems crumbling as we speak. The energy crisis in healthcare. It seems almost impossible in the UK to get a doctor's appointment or a dentist's appointment. And even if you do, the waiting lists are incredibly long. Schools seem to be declining in their ability to teach, and universities unable to educate to the levels that they once were. We can't build the things we used to be able to. We can't invent things as we used to be able to. And then at a cosmic level, well, we can at least see, the environmental movement goes way over the top on a lot of things. But there are ecological catastrophes caused by human negligence of the planet. We're cutting down rainforests like never before. We're destroying wildlife like never before. We're littering our oceans. We're doing all these things. We're to blame for so much of it. And yeah, everything's out of sync. I think anybody just living in the current moment can see we live in such a society. And given the tradition I've just been describing to you, you can very reasonably see that this must mean we are led by extremists. Because if we were led by people of the center, of the mean, who accorded with the natural order, we would not see so many people who are bent out of shape internally, a society which is dysfunctional in so many ways, and an environment which is collapsing all around us. I rest my case on that point. What the framing does, in particular, is it doesn't just say that these people are extremists, which is already bad, but because of these resonances of deficiency and excess to do with health, that the mean is to do with health, when we say you're extreme, there's an implicit connection. Because you are not of the golden mean, you must also, your extremism is unhealthy. And so it pathologizes the opponent. It says, well, actually, their point of view, it has no validity because it comes from a place of unwellness. If you were thinking rightly, if you were healthy and able to, approach the world properly, you wouldn't think the way you do. You wouldn't be extreme. And so it delegitimizes and cancels out the arguments of your opponents. It allows you to dismiss them without having to truly engage with their points. So you can see the framing is very powerful. And this is in contrast to, we have been the recipients of this, right? The dissident right, as it's called, or just the right more generally, for really since Wilhelm Reich's identification of sexual repression as a tool of all totalitarian regimes, and in his view, that would include everything from conservative to fascist, right? That and he would see them all being fascist. So sexual repression in our society is fascism. So the opponents of the kind of Marxist revolution must be sexually repressed. Adorno carries this on in his analysis of the psychology of the fascist. This gets applied to the conservatives more generally. We have been marked as the extremists, and thus we are these people who are sexually repressed or unhealthy in some way. And so we don't need to be considered in a meaningful sense. Indeed, we need to be cured. We need to go through cognitive bias training to deal with our various phobias, i.e. irrational responses to things, deficient and excessive in various ways, i.e. unhealthy, right? At its worst, we might need to be locked up in an asylum or in a hospital and receive various treatments until we are cured, maybe through a lobotomization. Think of a Clockwork Orange here. This was what C.S. Lewis was saying. The therapeutic mindset, the humanitarian mindset, allows you to treat somebody who disagrees with you as being ill, i.e. the extremist, and thus rather than dealing with their argument, like the Soviet Union, dealing with Christians, will put you through all forms of cure, torture, until you conform to our way of thinking. And indeed, if you think about what Paul Gottfried was saying, this is well, before I get to Paul Gottfried, let me just say then that That's what the DR has been. We've been under that umbrella, essentially. If you think like Ben Shapiro gets included in this category because he belongs to the right, and the right has that association of being extreme and thus unwell in some way, then we definitely have been. But by moving to the center, by holding the moderate mean, we no longer face that problem. It is our opponents who are extreme and thus requiring such treatment. In turn, this gives the impression of neutrality, right? Because if you're framing it in terms of natural law, or what's really there, that we're just responding to reality and trying to be in conformity with the order of the world, not trying to just impose our ideas upon it, but responding to what's actually there, and that's why we do what we do, well, it can come across as a non-issue. This is what Blair was really good at. He would say something like, we need to get beyond politics and deal with practical solutions to issues. Well, that makes it sound like a neutral thing, that it doesn't have a moral import. And so when it comes to asserting it, well, there's nothing to discuss. Actually, we just need to have a consensus because, oh, you're just telling us how things are. This is a bit of a deceitful thing because actually it is a moral issue. It's not a given because people disagree about the nature of the world and what's there. And then also, just because something is the case doesn't determine what we should do about it. So it gives the impression of a neutrality, but in reality it is not neutral. But because it appears neutral, because it's framed as a neutral thing, the center ground, the healthy place, the place where we'll get peace and so on. These are just the logical consequence of the center ground. Therefore, why would you oppose it? We just do it. There's no reason to debate it on the surface. At the same time, it allows us to be much more assertive. If you think about Nietzsche's Übermensch, this is an individual who doesn't kowtow to what others think, isn't afraid to put forward their point of view, but rather asserts his own moral values confidently. He demands that they be recognized. Now, if you belong to the distant right, by the very nature of all those who are in there, it is implicitly reactive. That it is all those who do not belong to the current mainstream responding to it. You're kind of looking back upon it and trying to give voice to your point of view, but from a position of where you've already been pushed out, that you cannot really demand what you want to happen. But if you take the center ground, if you say, no, these views are those which accord with reality, which the right order of the human being, with society and the natural world, then that's a strong place to assert your moral values, to say these things ought to happen and should happen. And I think we've seen on Twitter, in response to Academic Agent's posts, a number of people find a new lease of life and confidence in their positions, just with that simple framing. They have the same views, but by seeing themselves as the moral center, as the position of strength which ought to be asserted, they believe or feel the courage to share what they have to say, because they no longer are going to see themselves as extreme, but rather as warranted, I guess, or having the right to say what they ought to say or believe. So I think it has all of these strengths, the idea of the sensible center. It's a very powerful concept because of these deep historical resonances which have built up within our worldview, and we take them for granted. And so when we come to a debate, when you come with this concept of the sensible center and dubbing your opponent as an extremist, all of these ideas of order, proportion, and the mean are buried in there. Even if somebody's never read Aristotle or Aquinas, at some level in our culture, it's there. And so it's a very powerful idea, but it's not just powerful. What I want to get across is that it accords with reality itself. Because if we take seriously these ideas and this tradition, then the mean brings us into conformity with with the laws of nature, that this is how things ought to be, ourselves, society, and the natural world. And restoring these things to the mean, restoring them to order and harmony, that is the moral task before us. So it's not just a powerful idea, it's also true. We want to claim the center, both in a kind of political spectrum, but in real life. We want things to return to that center too. That's what we're striving for. So now I want to come to a couple of questions I have about this concept as it's been presented by Academic Agent in particular. And again, these aren't meant to be criticisms, but more putting forward potential pitfalls with it as it's been formulated. Because I think, as you can tell, I see strength in it, and I see something good in it. And I want to kind of refine it further and bolster it. Now, one of the things that I've been seeing is that the sensible center has been supported on the basis of a majoritarian thinking. We could say most people support these ideas, therefore they are sensible. Or it could be most people in history have thought this way, therefore we should do it. We're just representing the views of most people. We're not extreme, we're the center. I guess that's what I was trying to say. We are the center because we reflect the mainstay opinion of history. But I think we can see that intuitively, I had a little bit of a kind of reaction to this. I felt that there was something not quite right with it. And so I've put together these syllogisms to see the issues with it. So if we take it, the first syllogism, the sensible center is just what most people used to support in the past. So we represent the center because we represent the mainstay view of history. Well, if we're realistic, most people in the past supported slavery. Therefore, the sensible center supports slavery. Now, I think there's two issues we can see with this one. The first is, I don't think anybody in their right minds would, in our current context, be able to convince anybody that the center ground is a position which supports slavery in the modern world. I think that would be the cognitive dissonance required for that would be too great. And I think it would just be laughed out the room. But moreover, I distinctly remember, and if I'm wrong on this, I apologize, but I don't think it's something to be ashamed of. I've distinctly remember Academic Agent himself saying that he finds slavery abhorrent. That was in the past. He changes his views, so he might have something else to say. But he himself has said such a thing. So we have this kind of position then, and I think most people would also agree to greater or lesser extents. So what's the issue here then? Well, the point that I'm trying to raise is that there are things in the past which most people have held, which aren't good, first and foremost, and second, are not conducive to the idea of the sensible center. So you need to, it's not just as simple as saying we just represent what people in the past, most people in the past used to think. But then what if we said that the sensible center represents what most people today support? That if we asked most people, they would think in a certain way. And this isn't represented by our elites, our regime, but we represent it. Well, here's a second syllogism. The sensible center is just what most people support today. Second, most people today support democracy. Third, therefore, the sensible center supports democracy. Now let's deal with 2 and 3. Well, with 2, I noted that I think there's about 193 countries in the world, something like that. 167 are registered as democracies. Now, of course, if you've read The Populist Delusion, you know that democracy isn't a system which represents the will of the people. That is a myth. It's a form of circulating elites at best. It might be, you could say, a system which allows for the peaceful transition of essentially administrators within a regime, because they don't really make many of the decisions. They just administer on behalf of big finance, big tech, NGOs, certain policy arrangements. But it allows for the peaceful transition of those things. But nonetheless, most countries want to define themselves as democracies. And there's no great push to kind of return to other forms of government in these countries. That in itself might be an indication of that there is some kind of rhetorical and framing power behind the idea of democracy. People want to be on its side, in a sense. That doesn't necessarily mean Western democracy, but there is a sense in which it is there. But even if we didn't say the whole world, definitely in the Western context, which most of us belong to, you'd be hard pressed to find many people who are against democracy today. In fact, they probably largely only exist within our sphere. And this is the irony, right? So we've got this second principle that most people would support democracy in theory, in principle, in the West. And therefore the sensible center supports democracy. But ironically enough, most of the people who make up the sensible center probably would prefer something other than democracy as the form of government. So again, we've resulted in a conclusion which we wouldn't want to embrace. And we could do this with other things. I think maybe a stronger view, certainly in a Western context, is that most people today support some kind of sexual liberation, that you should be able to sleep with who you wish as long as it doesn't harm anybody else. You should be able to marry who you want to as long as it doesn't harm anybody else. And this is besides the issues of kind of same-sex marriage. In previous generations, a young man had to get the permission of the woman's parents, particularly the father, and it would be a community decision often. It wasn't just left up to the individuals involved. Is that something that the sensible center wants to support? I think there would be a disagreement on that point. So again, the majoritarian interpretation doesn't lead necessarily to where we want to be. I understand it's a good rhetorical tactic. We represent most people in history and today, but in actuality, it doesn't logically lead to our positions. I think a much stronger foundation is natural law. And this is in two senses, both in the sense of descriptive natural law, so those patterns of, I guess, those kinds of rules of reality, which cannot be circumvented. Perhaps an example would be that no matter how hard you try to impose sexual norms, some individuals will break them. So even in Puritan societies, and again, I'm sympathetic to what the Puritans did, where they would punish people who had sex outside of marriage with various disciplinary measures, such as sitting on the cutty stool during the sermon, or being pilloried or put in the stocks during the week. People still broke those rules during the Puritan period. That's why we know about the disciplinary processes, because they had to enforce them. It wasn't as many people as there are today. Vastly fewer would have engaged in such behavior. But nonetheless, it seems like there's a rule, we could say, that it's impossible to have a society which is in perfect obedience to Christian norms surrounding sexuality. Let's just put it that way. So that could be a descriptive rule. We could use discussions of the socio-sexual hierarchy as another kind of comparative point there, as another rule. So rules about the way alphas interact and gammas interact and so on. But then there are also prescriptive natural laws, things about the way the world should be. I'm not sure Academic Agent would agree with that point, but I think that there are both descriptive laws and there is the prescriptive, that is the return to the center point that I've been emphasizing throughout, and I won't go over again. But this is mediated to us. We don't just kind of know it in our heads. Rather, we have certain intuitions which correspond to the natural order, although they're buried today under the ideologies of modernity. They are there, and when they get the chance, they do burst forth in beautiful and glorious ways, such as with the funeral of the Queen. There's suddenly many people in England suddenly kind of felt the desire to be subservient to a king. This seems to be a breaking forth of our intuitions about the natural order, certainly about England's natural order. And but they are also mediated then by tradition, which is the collective wisdom, the winnowing and sifting of intuitions and ideas over time. And we thus receive again, indication of the natural law. So this again is maybe the majoritarian aspect coming through. But let's be clear, these are the means by which we might know them. Intuition, maybe rational consideration, and then tradition, putting those three things together. But these things in themselves are not the same, identical with the source of the sensible center, which is the natural law. So they can err, they can be wrong, and we can correct them with the natural order. I hope I've made myself kind of coherent in that point. I realized I was getting a bit tongue-tied. But there's another kind of point here, and this is coming from his Twitter. And I wanted to, because it wasn't in the video itself, but I think it's helpful to kind of go through some of these tweets because they're indicative of a certain aspect of the sensible center, which I think really helps to draw out. So beginning, Christianity on a strictly utilitarian basis, extreme. Even though there are 45,000 different sects of Christianity, my church should prevail over the others. Sensible center, that's not possible or desirable. The sensible center is driven by realism only, and realism says you won't unite 45,000 denominations in our lifetimes. Somebody replied, if you don't unite, you can either repress or split. Repression is where we are at, and splitting, as nice as that sounds, does not constitute a moderate option. I say abandon this specific framing and reformulate the proposition entirely. And then he replies, no, Christians can go off and do their own thing. The sensible center isn't about this. So here we have this idea that it would be unrealistic to include a religious element within the sensible center, that, or more particularly, we shouldn't seek to impose a religious settlement, that there shouldn't be a dominant religion within our society, or as one of our proposals. Instead, we should really maintain the current secularism. That's implied, at least. It's not stated, but I think it's implied that no one religion should dominate. Rather, all of our public institutions should remain neutral in theory, and that actually there should be no place for the religious element. And if somebody wants to do that, they're not part of the sensible center. I think this is tied to a later set of tweets that he put out today. And again, I hope I'm not overstepping the bounds looking at these tweets, but I think they're worthwhile to engage with. And this was halfway through, but you'll pick up the point he was making. Of course, the ultimate real case for most of this is religion, where God stands for Y, in for Y. In most cases, it is X that is at stake. X is intuitions and values derived from intuitions, whereas Y is an ideal. So in this case, it is X, the value, that is at stake, and the argument for how X, the value, conforms to Y, i.e. God, is just a lame attempt to justify X, i.e. God commands me to do X, therefore I should do X. In this way, even religion just delays the actual issue at stake, hence sects. There are many other cases of Y: social justice, liberty, equality, socialism for the fatherland. Whatever, I argue for the basic elimination of Y from arguments as an unnecessary step that amounts to little more than rhetoric. Arguing for X for its own sake is more authentic. As King Lear says, the thing itself. This produces a much more robust argument than needing to frame X in reference to Y. Not to mention foregoing the fact that such arguments always bastardize Y too. So what you're essentially seeing then is AA calling for the elimination of the religious from argumentation or public discourse. Now, this is a private thing for you, your experience of God and so on, but really it has no business when it comes to policy proposal. In part, this is because it adds nothing to the strength of the argument according to natural reason or objectivity. And if we relate this back to what we were saying in this, with regards to the 17th century, it's because ultimately it has a subjective origin. Either it is your own experiences, or it is your trust in something else, a tradition, which itself is a collection of experiences, or maybe a scripture, which itself is a written record of a set of experiences. And again, these religious experiences are private in nature, thus they cannot be they're not accessible to all people, and thus they form a weak basis for finding consensus within a society or for argumentation, because when it comes to a certain issue, say we're arguing about something, well, if I then invoke God, well, if you don't believe in God or have never experienced God, you're just not going to buy that argument, right? Because it's not something accessible to you. It's only going to be an argument that works for other people who have either had similar experiences or, trust in the same source. But that's not good for persuading large numbers of people. Certainly not if we're just using a rational objectivity as the basis. So there's no place for a religion within that context. It has to be excluded, because the only way you could enforce then these religious points of view is through coercion, forcing people to adopt your positions. I mean, this is in essence Locke's argument that because you cannot force somebody to believe a certain religious claim, because that's only up to the supernatural, you must have toleration of religious points of view. But in effect, that also means then that religious perspectives cannot dominate the political scene, that actually they should not be allowed to have official status or authority when it comes to political decision making. That has to be done on a rational and empirical basis, using methodologies, or such as scientific methodology, to establish in an objective way, in a way that's reliable and accessible to all people, can be tested by all people, our propositions, our premises, and our conclusions. And I can see the strength of this, particularly in our current context. We do live in what you might call a secular society, although in England, the Church of England is still part of the state. The monarch is the head of the Church of England, and bishops do sit in the House of Lords, so they do have an impact upon the upon our country, on its legislation and so on. Church does have a role, but most people are not practicing Christians, even if they would say they are culturally Christian. Most people are not adherents to the Church of England. Even if they're Christian, they might not attend the Church of England. And in public debate, you will never hear people referring to their religion in a meaningful way. It might be an example of something, but it's not. People don't appeal to to the Ten Commandments as a basis for political policy. Although, interestingly enough, Tony Blair did famously say that he prayed about the decision to go and invade Iraq. So, the great Dark Lord himself cited religion as a as a basis for his decision making. But if we return to the majoritarian form of argumentation that academic agent has been putting in, I think that actually a society without religion, without formal religion, is led by extremists. Let's put it this way. If most people in history support something, then it is sensible and centrist, i.e. the sensible center represents the viewpoint of most people in history. Well, I think it's reasonable to say that most people in history have supported and participated in religious involvement, and they've seen religion as an important part of political and civil society. Indeed, it should have an influence upon political and civil society. I think that's indisputable when you look at any society prior to the 19th century, even including the 19th century. And those societies which call themselves secular often have what's a pseudo religious quality. So today, although we've got a secular establishment, look at something like the environmentalists, Extinction Rebellion, and Just Stop Oil. They have a religious quality to them. People have called them the New Puritans. I think that's a great slight on the Puritans personally, but they do have that aspect. So there is a quasi-religious element, and it's seen as appropriate to influence political and civil society. So we could even say today it's there, even if it's not in the formal ritual and is not formally recognized as a religion. Therefore, by this logic, there should be religious involvement in political and civil society. And if I wanted to press the case further, I would say most civilizations prior to our own have had some kind of official state religion, if you can call it a state. Then there has been some kind of formal rituals and so on, with a certain metaphysic, and these have had some shape on the political nature of those civilizations. So we could make it even stronger and say, therefore, most people in history have seen it fit that there should be an official religion within a civilization. So by the logic that's been put forward before, the sensible centrist position, if it represents what most people have thought in history, is to have a kind of religious element recognized and influential within a society. But as I said, there's problems with the majoritarian view. It might be wrong on this point, right? So let's put it down to natural law. And this is a descriptive kind of argument, value-free. Something is a common feature of human societies. It is a natural law that it is part of human society. So if it keeps coming up, if it's recurring wherever there are groups of people forming into, coalitions and alliances, then we should probably see it as an integral part of what makes groups. Well, religious institutions and rituals, and we could add beliefs, are a common feature of human societies. Therefore, it is a natural law that religious institutions and rituals are a part of human societies. As a consequence, they form part of the moral, social, and cosmological center, and we should seek to have a formal religious institutions and rituals as part of our society. That seems to follow from the logic of these positions. And it's actually the extreme position to say that religion should have no part in our no meaningful part in our civic and political life. Indeed, I think the evidence of that is it's really only been the last 200 years, well, shorter than that, the last 100 years, that point of view has been put forward. And so I think this is this would be a point that I would like to hear what Academic Agent would have to say to that, because he seems very set on it. I understand the practicality point about getting denominations to agree and such like, but in England we have the Church of England. It exists already. Yes, it is a feeble and perverted institution as it stands, but that doesn't mean the sensible centre shouldn't seek in a restored Church of England, for example. And indeed, it would tie in a kind of cultural way with those resonances of the middle way that I've already been articulating earlier on. I think, though, there's a deeper point beyond the discussion of whether religion should be a part of sensible centrism, because the way that I've been kind of discussing it, and I think it's been framed, is that sensible centrism proposes seemingly neutral, practical solutions to our current situation. That it's a series of policy proposals. So, i.e., we should reduce immigration, that we don't need to have as many managers, and that if we follow these policies, things will work better, that we'll live in a better society, that it will be more conducive to the good life, and so on. And there's much to be said for that. I think we live in things are getting worse all the time, and it seems that even if we just had a more efficient version of our system, things would be a lot better for a lot of people. I think of the health service in the United Kingdom, where it's almost impossible to get an appointment. And if you do, your treatment is very patchy. You don't get the care that you would often desire. You're treated as a nuisance for being ill in the health service often. And I find that disgraceful. And then the amount of management in the health service is outrageous. And the expense spent on managers and executive assistants and personal assistants, the bureaucracy in general, the expenses they get and the goodies they get is unbelievable. I'll give you an example. In Scotland, there is a trust, a health trust, where the personal assistants, upon entering the job, are all bought a brand new top of the range phone with a top of the range, most expensive contract. Costs on average about £1,000 per personal assistant. This is outrageous. Think of and then there's like, I don't know, 50 personal assistants in this trust. So you're talking like £50,000. It's probably less than that, 30 odd £1,000 on phones. On phones. For these individuals. So you could if we had just a better running system, things would be a lot better. You could hire a nurse for that, right? Probably do, given today. So it's outrageous. But the issue with pragmatism, and I note pragmatism has been one of the key words of the Sensible Centre, is that if you just focus on pragmatism and say, oh, we need to expunge the ideological, the classic Blair move, well, pragmatism, it's not an end in itself, right? What works will always be to a certain standard. There'll be certain assumptions at play about what it means for something to work. These could be intuitive values, let's say. And so we need to question whether these values that underpin our society are good. Because we may be able to get things to work. We may be able to persuade people that our policies will work, such as these ones I've outlined, but they work according to the values of most people today, or many of the values within our worldview of modernity. And I'm not just talking about woke. That's clearly like being anti-woke, right? Though that is very relatively recent. I'm more talking about, like, I'd say from the 19th and 20th centuries. There are key values. And if we focus on pragmatism, we don't question whether these values are good or bad for society in general, and whether these need to be displaced. We've already mentioned secularism, and I think many people would see the decline of religious belief and practice as having has had a terrible impact upon individuals in terms of their satisfaction in life, their moral behavior in terms of living for others or for themselves, in community cohesion, and then on a kind of broader sense of national identity and unity, providing a framework for argumentation, sharing values, and so on. These things are all bad. And then beyond that, as a Christian myself, I would say we've abandoned the truth. We've abandoned that which is real about the world for an illusion, for a lie, that there is no God or no divine or sacred. And being cut off from the center, the origin, has had a detrimental effect upon all of us. But then other values. So Jacques Ellul would say from the 19th century onwards, there's been an emphasis upon efficiency in all spheres. This is seeking the best method for attaining any goal. And whereas in the past, in the pre-modern world, people were quite happy to maintain methods which worked, right, in any activity. So as long as it worked, then it's okay. It might be something I've inherited from my forefathers when it comes to carpentry, let's say. I might add my own idiosyncratic style, but in general, it doesn't have to be the very best. As long as it's good enough, then that's fine. But when it comes to modernity, there's this drive to seek the very best method in all contexts. This, in turn, leads to a rationalization of all things. We have to justify why we're doing what we're doing and why we're not doing it in a way that could be better. And so we ought to replace our older traditional methods, our those distinctive ways that we've inherited to do things, and replace them with that which reason says is the very best. We've also live in a context where human nature has been reduced to homo economicus, what it can produce and what it can consume and what it costs. That we analyze it purely in economic terms. And this is itself both the product and cause of the boom in, I guess, commune capital, the rise of capitalism, the defining of oneself in terms of the material possession and purchase, the reducing of human well-being to material good, and that is both on the capitalist and the communist side. The communists just want, and the socialists see human flourishing as just everybody having the same amount or a fair amount of material goods. The libertarians say, human flourishing is you being able to achieve of your hard work, a good amount of material wealth. We've been reduced to that. Moreover, there is a doctrine of happiness, that happiness, or in today's parlance, mental health, is the greatest good, and we should pursue these things above all else. And indeed, our money should be spent on our happiness instead of maybe a prior idea of the good or being a virtuous person as the best thing. We ought to be a happy person. Indeed, the biggest sign I can think of this change is if you ask a parent about their children, what they want for their children, many of them will say today, I just want my son or daughter to be happy. Whereas I mean, they probably didn't ask these things as much in the past, but I think there would have been more of a sense, what do you want for your child? I want them to be virtuous. I want them to be good. That's not the language anymore. It's happiness. It's pleasure. And we see this in the emphasis on sexual liberation in particular, that you are most fully yourself, you are most fulfilled when you break free of sexual repression and both express and fulfill your sexual desires, when you feel sexual pleasure, right? This is tied to health. We have an obsession with how healthy we are, physically and mentally. And this is seen as a neutral basis for justifying many courses of action. So the clearest example would be that because COVID-19 was deemed to pose a threat to human life, to many people's lives, because this was a danger to people's health, therefore we should lock down the economy. We should close businesses, leisure activities, prevent people from seeing their loved ones, prevent people from attending funerals, getting married, going about the basics of everyday life. We should put everything else on hold. Everything else is subordinate to protecting your health. And by and large, most people went along with this, right? Most people supported it, at least in the UK. So you have this idea that within our culture, and I think it flows from the fact that because we're materialists, many of us, there's no afterlife. So what we want is to continue our lives for as long as possible. Rather than living a good life, we want a long life. And ultimately, these things in various ways all combine to the idea that we are individuals who come from nowhere, as it were. We are deracinated, we are undifferentiated human matter. And we define ourselves by our choices and preferences, by how we feel. And we will make the world accommodate to how we feel about ourselves. And we will express who we are. We will decide who we are by the things we buy into and purchase. So the bands whose music I listen to defines a bit of who I am. The books I read, the people I give super chats to, the t-shirts and the brands that I buy t-shirts from, the whether I drink Coke or Pepsi, whether I eat Dairy Milk or Galaxy, these things all help to define who I am. I am the sum of my choices, economic choices. These are all aspects of post-Enlightenment, worldview. I think they're implicit in many of the ways we think. They're not bad necessarily, not all of them anyway. It's not bad to want better methods in principle, right? We want things to be easier and more immediate and have a better product for less effort. I don't think that's a bad thing. But when it comes to dominate, is it so good? When it leads to the dismantling of tradition, is it good? When it leads to something like mass immigration because it's more efficient, is that good? Or the emphasis on happiness rather than virtue. That doesn't seem like a good value, but yet it underpins the whole. Well, it underpins consumerism to a T. It underpins the emphasis on tolerance of others' behavior, because who are you to judge what makes them happy? And so on. My point with all of this is to say, well, it's all very well saying we want to do what's sensible, we want to do what's pragmatic, but pragmatism is dependent. What works is dependent upon the values by which we define success or what's good in our personal lives and social lives. And it may be that even if you do certain things, that actually we need to overturn many of these values, that these shouldn't be what's ordering many of our lives, because they have led to atomized people who are suffering spiritually and socially. That we've been totally dislocated from communities, that we no longer seem to have accountability in our societies, and people are being reduced to serfs within a global system for the benefit of the few. These seems to have been the logical consequences of some of these values. Putting forward policies which seem reasonable to people who think in or feel in accordance with these ideas and these values is going to get you so far. But you've still got the underlying problems of the worldview and thus of the way people treat each other within the society. So you can get rid of woke, you can reduce immigration, you can have maybe more support for families, you can have less managers. Is that all that you want? Because I think some people do really just want those things, which would be great successes. But there are deeper issues about the way we live. For example, in previous eras, we're atomized today. In the past, you were locked into many relationships, formal relationships, which defined your place within the hierarchy. So your pledge of loyalty to your Lord and his pledge to protect you, this isn't just a voluntary association. This isn't just a relationship with an organization that provides for your welfare. This is a personal relationship between one man and another in a hierarchy, which provides security and meaning in a way that paying tax to the government does not. You can't change that just with pragmatism or being sensible, because being sensible is being reasonable within a framework that has certain values. And the values at stake, the very values themselves are wrong-headed, or many of them are, or the combination. And so to oppose these values is to be unreasonable to many people, to be radical rather than sensible, to be, as AA has said, a fantasist, perhaps even extreme. But perhaps this is important. And I want to read a bit from Thomas Carlyle. We're getting towards the end here. This is from Past and Present, Part 1, Chapter 4, named The Morrison's Pill. And it's a few passages that I want to read, and then I'll give a little bit of an analysis. You can find other places on the channel where I've done more extensive discussion of Carlyle. I'm using him in part because he's somebody that's respected within these spheres. He's held as a bit of an authority, somebody who's got a point, somebody who Academic Agent respects as well. He's had a Carlyle Day, which I was delighted to be a little part of. Somebody that Curtis Yarvin also has held in high regard. Doesn't mean he's totally right, doesn't mean that he's got everything sorted, but he's somebody that we should listen to and take seriously, because he's helped many of us get to where we are. So I want to just read through a couple of passages about what he would say to this, and then we will we'll head towards the end. So, it seems to be taken for granted by these interrogative philosophers that there is some thing or handful of things which could be done, some act of parliament, remedial measure or the like, which could be passed, whereby the social malady were fairly fronted, conquered, put an end to, so that, with your remedial measure in your pocket, you could then go on triumphant and be troubled no farther. You tell us the evil, cry such persons, as if justly aggrieved, and do not tell us how it is to be cured. It were infinitely handier if we had a Morrison's Pill, Act of Parliament, or remedial measure, which men could swallow one good time and then go on in their old courses, cleared from all miseries and mischiefs. Unluckily, we have none such. Unluckily, the heavens themselves, in their rich pharmacopoeia, contain none such. There will no thing be done that will cure you. There will a radical, universal alteration of your regimen and way of life take place. There will a most agonizing divorce between you and your chimeras, luxuries, and falsities take place. A most toilsome, all but impossible return to nature and her veracities and her integrities take place, that so the inner fountains of life may again begin, like eternal light fountains, to irradiate and purify your bloated, swollen, foul existence, drawing nigh, as at present, to nameless death. Either death or else all this will take place. Judge if, with such diagnosis, any Morrison's Pill is like to be discoverable. If thou ask again, Therefore, on the Morrison's pill hypothesis, what is to be done? Allow me to reply. By thee, for the present, almost nothing. Thou there, the thing for thee to do is, if possible, to cease to be a hollow-sounding shell of hearsays, egoisms, purblind dilettantisms, and become, were it on the infinitely small scale, a faithful, discerning soul. Thou shalt descend into thy inner man, and see if there be any traces of a soul there. Till then there can be nothing done. O brother, we must, if possible, resuscitate some soul and conscience in us, exchange our dilettantisms for sincerities, our dead hearts of stone for living hearts of flesh. Then shall we discern not one thing, but in clearer or dimmer sequence a whole endless host of things that can be done. Do the first of these. Do it. The second will already have become clearer, doabler. The second, third, and 3,000th will then have begun to be possible for us. Not any universal Morrison's pill shall we then, either as swallowers or as vendors, ask after at all, but a far different sort of remedies. Quacks shall no more have dominion over us, but true heroes and healers. I love reading Carlyle. Isn't he wonderful? I think what Carlyle's essentially saying is it's not enough just to propose a set of policies. The way people feel and think about the world has to change. It has to be altered because most of us, our values are making us see the world in the wrong way. We have all of the wrong assumptions. We think in purely economic and material terms. We think in purely utilitarian terms about the objects we engage with. We need to have, and I think he's very influenced by the Puritans on this point, and the Scottish Calvinist tradition he came from, a transformation of our minds, of how we feel, and of how we act. And for the Calvinists, this is done by the Holy Spirit, by God himself, to change what we love and what we hate, moving us from loving the sinful to loving what is holy, moving us from hating what is holy to hating what is sinful. So you can see this is a total 180. It's a, as he said, a transformation which is going to be painful, which is going to cut off much of what we love from ourselves, but in turn bring about a great new loves, which are totally different. And we will be out of sync with the old world and want to bring it with us. That is what makes a great hero. The great man or the hero of Carlyle is he already has this, whether he's born with it or has gone through this transformative process. He then is absolutely committed to the transcendent. He's no longer resisting it or apathetic towards it. He sincerely, with all his being, with all of his thoughts and feelings and actions, is devoted to it. And thus he wants to bring the world into conformity with the natural order, with the laws of the universe, with God. Always, Carlyle will describe it. If that is the case, if that's what's really required, then being sensible is actually an obstruction to the radical restoration or revolution of Carlyle. Because the sensible centrist, let's say, will be posing this as an extreme position, that Carlyle's an extremist. He is consequently somebody who needs to be sectioned for being unwell, who's a rabble-rouser, a disruptor, somebody that shouldn't be listened to. And what's key there, it's not the center part which is the issue, it's the sensible, because the sensible is the pragmatic, it's within the current worldview. But what's precisely needed is the overturning of the worldview in Carlyle's. Not just the worldview, but the intuitions underpinning it. But the sensible proceeds from our current intuitions. I think we can maybe even put this further with Plato's cave. The idea, well, it's a part of the Republic, and probably his most famous work. And the allegory of the cave goes something like this. You can see here there is a bunch of people who have their necks tied by chains. They cannot move, and they're looking towards a wall where they see various objects moving along. And over time, they become quite adept, some of them, at identifying some of these objects. And they begin to categorize them. They get status because they're able to identify the patterns in which they appear, and so on. But then one day, one of them is freed, and he is able to turn around, and he sees that the objects on the wall are not, in fact, real. They are merely shadows. And the shadow, as we can see, is being produced by people walking behind the wall, holding up little puppets or images before a fire. So this is the real thing. The people here are looking towards the shadows and think they are the real thing. But then the person is able to turn beyond the fire towards the light at the edge of the cave. At first, it's too bright for them. They need to cover their eyes. And they'll work their way up to the mouth of the cave and exit. And their eyes will still be too weak. They've been in darkness all this time. So at first, they'll look at the reflections of things in the water. Then in time, they will be able to look at objects themselves, like this tree here. And then finally, when their eyes have adjusted enough, they will be able to look at the sun itself. Unfortunately, when the enlightened person who has seen the real world, who knows what's truly there, the natural order as it actually is, returns to these people who are enchained, they are considered mad, insane, dangerous, and thus are killed by these people here. Now, there are various interpretations of this idea, and I don't want to get into all of them now. I guess the point that I'm trying to make is that in Plato's conception, most people are living a somewhat illusory life, that what they think is really there, they are mistaken about. And this is true both on an epistemological level, that they're wrong about the nature of reality. So because their perception of reality is not right. But then also, it's not just that we see the world wrong. We also have the wrong moral judgments about the world too. Going back to this excessive and deficient again. And it's only by being freed and educated and taught how to see the real, and this being a big transformation and a long process, that we are able to engage with the world as it is in all of its fullness, not just the material, but also the immaterial. The Matrix is a kind of modern rendition of this, that most people live in a simulated reality, and we need to get out of the simulation or the simulacra and return to the real. But in doing so, we become alien to those who are trapped within the illusion. They cannot imagine anything else. They belong fully to that world. And so it's not sensible what we say if we've gone through that process. I guess I'm kind of going to skip these little bits here because we're pressing on. We're already at 2020. So what I would say, just to kind of make this point clearer, is I think there's a fundamental division in this sphere, and there's many attempts to kind of draw fault lines. I think one of them is whether you think that we are in a position like Plato's cave when it comes to society, that we need a fundamental alteration in ourselves before there can be real change of real significance towards what's better, or whether you think that we don't need to change and that by and large, if we get some policies right, then that is enough. I think that's one of the big dividing lines within this sphere. And I think that's one of the issues with the sensible centrist approach. I agree full-heartedly with the center point. I hope the first part of the stream has really tried to show that the center isn't just somewhere on a political scale. It's a spiritual, physical, social, and cosmological reality which binds things in order. But I question the sensible bit because I think it's tied to certain post-enlightenment assumptions, which, when you're in conversation with somebody, they have these values, and so when you say things which are sensible, they're in accordance with those values, but those values are part of the illusion, or they could be, and we need more fundamental change in a Carlylean sense. But by its very definition, that isn't sensible. That's a radical position. So I guess what I've kind of articulated is a radical center, which uses center in a lot of different ways combined. Now, I appreciate that is maybe loses some of the rhetorical power of the kind of rational, reasonable versus the extreme, deluded, and ill. But I think the combination maybe gets around it because you've still got the center idea versus the extremes, which I think is important. But on the other hand, Yarvin has this idea that if we're going to succeed, we need to be cool. And I'm not sure being sensible is cool, but being radical is cool because you're going against the man and standing up to, the authorities and orthodoxy and going beyond into the truth. It's very boomer truth idea, but I think it's still there. You see it with Extinction Rebellion. It's mainly young people who want to rebel against the current order, who see what many of the things that are wrong on a personal, social, and cosmological level, and it's being channeled into environmental activism on behalf of corporations, governments, and NGOs. But radical is cool. And so maybe a radical center, would that be more appealing? Maybe it's an appeal to a different group. Perhaps. I'm not sure. Nonetheless, though, I don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. And this is going to be my final point before turning to super chats. I think, and so if you want me to engage with anything, feel free to send in a super chat just now, and I'll get to it very shortly. I think if you have the sort of view that Plato had, which the Calvinists had, which many Christians have, that there needs to be a fundamental alteration in what people love, their intuitions, and so on, if we're going to see real change in society. Not necessarily perfection. I'm not saying this from a utopian point of view, but more towards the what we've had in the past, then you might be concerned about the sensible center. And there's a temptation to just oppose it, full stop. But I think we're not in a position where we can choose the reality we have yet. And even if it's not perfect, I would much rather we lived in a society which was which was sensible, even according to its own values, than we have at the moment. If it means that we have better support for families, less immigration, that we have efficiency in our services, that would be better. And it might be a step towards a more radical overhaul in time. It might be. It could, as I've said, it could be also be an obstacle because it's sensible. Therefore, there's a consensus that it's against the extreme, which the radical Carlyle approach would take. But nonetheless, I don't want to just see it as an enemy. I think it might be better. It would be better if we had sensible centrism than what we've got at the moment. And I don't think attacking it in the pursuit of a radical center is productive. I think we would just remain how we are at the moment, where sensible centrism has some chance of getting off the floor. Radical centrism, that's got a long way to go, because that's about the formation of heroes. And at the moment, there's not many heroes, is there? Even somebody like Elon Musk is not really a hero in Carlyle's sense. So I think I'm sympathetic to it. I hope I've outlined many of the strengths of it, why it appeals to some really deep ideas within us and our culture, and how it gets round certain aspects of framing, which I really appreciate, and I want to laud and applaud AA and Carl for coming up with this idea. It has political power and traction. I want to say, though, that I've raised some questions that maybe there might be a response to, maybe not, but things that need worked out and over time may become points of broader discussion. But fundamentally, I think it's a tricky one, but I want to see how it goes, and I wish it all the best. I myself will claim the center, but maybe a more radical version. We shall see. We shall see. Either way, I think it's an interesting idea, and one of the things I really appreciate about Academic Agent, I don't think people really compliment him enough on this, but he's got a great ability to produce interesting ideas on a regular basis. Whether you agree with them or not, he is able to engage you in and make you think about things. And he's able to do that, bringing in all these different influences, many of them I'd never come across before, such as Carlyle. He introduced me to Carlyle. I think he's really good at that, and this is another example of it. And I really hope he continues in that. I really do. Anyway, enough of me saying such things. Indeed, all the while smoking a cigar, if he ever does. Indeed, good to see you, Lady of Shalott, as well. So I'm going to do some super chats now. Feel free to put any questions or comments in super chats or in the comments and I might get to them. We'll see. I might go for another half an hour. This might be a 3-hour stream. I can't promise I'll get to your comment though if it's not a super chat. So let's see. Let me open up the super chat box. Nord Hugger for $5. Thank you very much, sir. Very kind. And excellent channel. Everybody should check him out. It's a good channel. Let me put it in the chat for you. Keep up the great work, mate. Thanks for renewing the spirit and wisdom of our North Sea heritage with a couple of swords, a shield, and a cross. You're very welcome, my friend. And thank you for doing the same too on your channel. I think it's, to me, that's the most important thing about all this. I do this stuff because well, I mean, who knows our true motivations? But I think what motivates me about all of these discussions and talks and things is I want to pursue the good and the true, but not just in an abstract sense, in my own particular context, my own heritage, and so on. And I think we find that in many of our myths and so on. I think as well. So that's what I try to do. I'm trying to find these things when I'm researching these streams and talking about them and working them out with you guys. You help me to do that, and I hope that some of you get to come along too. But yeah, it's a journey. I'm making little steps here and there. So thank you for your super chat. Sabine Wren 21, formerly Ellen Hutter. Oh, Ellen Hutter. Now I have to call you Sabine Wren. I'll do it. Sabine Wren 21 for £10 British sterling. Thank you very much. Best currency. Perhaps we are in a melancholic age. Also, did they not also think that astrological signs affected passions? Regardless, an interesting idea. My only problem with sensible centrism is it sounds wishy-washy, in my opinion. Oh, lots of good points there. So yes, let me deal with the astrological thing first. Yes, they did. They definitely did. It's not something I know lots about. But if you think again about this idea of the motion of music moves us to imitate it, well, then think of the planets moving, the music of the spheres taking place. All motion creates sound and music for Pythagoras. So if certain movements are taking place in the spheres, even though we can't hear it, it is working on us at a spiritual level. So it's moving us to imitate that which is going on amongst the stars and the planets. So then how we feel, or our mood, or our dispositions in the astrological view is altered by not just by the seasons or the climate, but also the celestial movements. It's really cool. I love how all these things are integrated, and it's difficult to think in these terms with our atomized view of life. But yeah, I think there's probably some truth to it at some level. Are we in a melancholic age? Possibly. I think if a 17th century physician was around now, he would probably diagnose a lot of people with melancholia, because many of the symptoms, such as depression, anxiety, stress, feelings about suicide, and so on, they're on the rise, aren't they? Interestingly, both the 16th/17th centuries and our own age were great times of social and technological and economic change. You had the birth of capitalism, the formation of nation states, massive wars. Yeah, so I can see it. I can see it. And then finally, my only problem with Sensible Center is it sounds wishy-washy. It does sound a bit wishy-washy, but I think I think we definitely are. If you understand the center as I've tried to outline it, as the heart of reality, or that which provides unity and order across all spheres, that's not a wishy-washy idea, that's a strong idea. The sensible might be the washy idea. So what if we said radical or strong center or something like that? Does that sound better? I don't know. I don't know. I'm not a propaganda expert. We'll need to ask Pharaoh. But yes, thank you again for your super chat. Much appreciated, Sabine Wren 21. Snooze you lose for 10 US dollars. Thank you very much for the stream. Very kind of you, Snooze you lose. And as he didn't make a specific comment, let's put in one that you've just said. So, in a culture war that has political outcomes, promoting a far middle would need something basic to grasp. A 30-second bite, sane ground. I feel like I've come into something that I don't quite know where you're coming from here. The flat right I'm seeing above. I don't know what the flat right is. Yeah, if you want to come back to me on what the flat right is, that might be helpful. Yeah, I mean, you've got like Elon. If it's just the breadth of it, like what it includes, you have like Elon Musk saying, the extremes constitute 20% of people, the extreme right and the extreme left, the far right and the far left, and then you've got like the middle 80%, the sensible centrist 80%. That to me is a bit of an abuse of language, but is Elon Musk. He can say what he wants. Thank you very much again, Snoozy Lees. Vingle, just in for 50. Is that krona? Norwegian krona? Thank you very much. Very connecting with my Norse roots. I have 1% Norwegian DNA. I'm very happy to say. So I feel this is connecting with my ancestral roots. Probably the abuse of some Viking raider somewhere, but we won't get into that. In my opinion, sensibleness and radicalism are not in opposition. It's clear that we need radical change, but it makes sense within your framing. Well done, NCJH. Yeah, I can see that. It is the right thing to do. It is the rational thing to do. So you could say that radical overhaul of and transformation personally and socially is needed, and certainly the idea of the center demands that. I think, and if it's taken in that sense, I think it's a good idea. I think the problem that I see with it is that what's deemed sensible isn't what's actually rational, but what is rational according to modernity's values or the values of today, if you see what I mean. So what we ought to do, yes, it's sensible, but according to today, it's not sensible. So I think it has the danger of limiting people's frameworks to what's sensible for today. But hopefully that wouldn't be the case. I just see it as a potential pitfall, an obstruction, perhaps. Let's see. Oh yes, we are related then, Vingle. That is great news. I am honoured to be related to you. Empire Expects has come in. The flat right is the political engaged right. Think debate bros and parties like the AfD in Germany. Oh, I see. Okay, so then what is the flat? Where was it? The far middle. Is that the same thing? Or is it a similar thing? I guess like a politically engaged middle. The sensible center, politically engaged. Yeah, if you guys have any more comments, I'm not. Let's see. Should I start from the beginning? I'm not going to go right back to the beginning, but I'll stay in. If you have comments and things, put them in the chat, and I'll engage with them. I see. So the far left, the far right, the far middle. See, this is. I think this would be bad framing because far left and far right are the extremes, and even if the far middle, by its very nature, wouldn't be extreme, it's connected with the idea of extremity. Far, right? You don't. I've never heard far something in terms of politics as not extreme. So you lose then the idea of the center. And far center wouldn't really relate either. What you need then is, and with that identification with the extreme, you get delegitimized, you get pathologized, and so on. So I get the idea because it is a radical agenda, but it's not. But the word "far" is the problem there. That's what I'm saying. If it could be articulated in a different way, I'm on board. I'm on board. Yeah, yeah. So I guess that's kind of what AA is putting forward, right? So it could be he wants people in our spheres to rebrand as sensible centrists, or like the Reform Party in the UK to be sensible centrists, saying we're just representing what people, most people think. We're dealing with what's real, not what you guys are coming up with. And it will probably play well in our current system, as long as it's not trying to be too radical on fundamental values. And it wouldn't be, because most political parties have people, even these sorts of parties, don't tend to have people interested in worldview transformation too much. Let's see. I like it. They're not quite far right. Sounds very British. This is very true. I found with the Marx schemes that you can get away with the most not very good argumentation and still pass, because you get marked on how much you know rather than your ability to construct an argument oftentimes. And well, the less said about it, the better, I suppose. The one good thing is, I think, and one of the good things actually about YouTube and Twitter and all these spaces is you have to that there's a healthy argumentation in this sphere. It can get overly emotional. People can get into insults and silly dramas and so on. But in the kind of academic agent sphere, there are people who will have good discussions and put each other through their paces intellectually and force them to make coherent, cogent, and sound arguments and test their arguments. That's a good thing. And we have that here. So yeah, it might not be in other places, but it's here. And I think that's why this appeals to so many of us. This place is we get to think and think through things, which is an enjoyable thing to do. And it's also something we don't get in many other places. Breach the third dimension, the top. Yes, indeed. Injecting radical for the young idealists. Well, for like a lot of the DR, I guess, then, right? there's a lot of people within our sphere who are young and under 20, under 30, who have nothing to lose. You're not going to get them with sensible centrism. One thing I was thinking was that sensible centrism is the perfect brand for an ideology created by dads in their 40s. Who get their clothes from Sainsbury's, right? It's not something that an 18-year-old's coming up with. It's definitely a dad political philosophy. Nothing wrong with dad political philosophy. Bring back the the early modern patriarch of his household. Sensible centrism. Near middle. Yes, we can find so many different combinations of these things. No, never the left. Never the left, Sackers. Let's see. Yes, I've noticed it even in unskilled jobs when dealing with younger people. I'm only 28 myself. My dad went to work straight after school and he was smarter than these educated people. Indeed, it's I think it's we've lost that kind of basic common sense which comes from tradition and intuition because we've over intellectualized a lot of things. We've deconstructed a lot of these. Oh, sorry, a lot of wisdom, replaced it with rationalization, and so many of the things people in prior ages would have relied on, natural smarts, is being eradicated and replaced by something which is not great. But then there's other factors as well. I would say things like Twitter and social media have had a detrimental effect on people's attention span and ability to think because things are very instantaneous. We also live in a culture which emphasizes emotional response over intellectual argument. My experience or my lived experience counts more than a rational argument when it comes to decision making. This is also part of democracy, I guess. Like the politician who can stir you up emotionally is going to get your vote more than the one that makes a cogent argument. So there's all these reasons why we're being pushed in this direction. So I don't think it's just people are themselves less intelligent necessarily, but the society we live in helps to produce less intelligent people. Is that not an indictment on where we're at? Empire expects. I should say as well, while we're doing this, thank you to everybody who's commented thus far, who may have commented earlier but isn't around now. Thanks also to the lurkers, those who are watching silently. You're often not noticed, but you're very much appreciated. So Empire expects, yes, there must be a separation to the intellectual arm we call the deep right. Understand sensible centrism as a tool for the political arena. And indeed, that's where its power comes from. It would succeed to a certain degree if probably not Nigel Farage, but somebody like him in the UK called themselves a sensible centrist. I think, but I do think there probably does need to be some degree of intellectual overlap. So some people will need to kind of work it out intellectually, the policies and so on. But maybe it's in the intellectual sphere you could have your radical center. Maybe that's where it could be. Lady of Shalott, wonderful Lady of Shalott. She is she's just like a bright light that every time I see her in a comment section, I think, oh, there's Lady of Shalott. Always wonderful to see. Your dad would have been smarter than these educated people. I found it massively frustrating by the end of my time in academia. Indeed. Me too. Vingle, my brother. Being radical is rad. When I hear centrist, I think gauche moral infirmity. People who are content with giving and taking between left and right to more or less maintain the status quo. Yes, I can see that, and I think it can have that connotation in the modern political context. But what we want is the strong centre, the moral centre, the universe's centre, Fingal. We want to return to that. That's what we want, the natural order reinstated. Tim Pool will not be part of the radical centre. Indeed, Bjarki. He is a threat to Swedish democracy. Maybe he will be part of the radical centre then. He is an extremist after all. I mean, he had Kanye on his show. He must be an extremist, even if he disagrees with it. I love it. Radical dadism. Yes, we need more dadism. Fatherhood for the win. But it's ironic, isn't it? Because on the one hand, AA is he's a dad. On the other hand, he's kind of promoting people like Red Hawk, who is against the institution of marriage like for young men, is against forming families and such like at a young age anyway for men. So he's not really pro fatherhood in that respect. He's in this, but yeah, at the same time, AA is pro radical dadism. I don't get it, man. I don't get it. Yeah, I think it's it's that constant encouragement and supportiveness in our culture, which prevents people from failing, because failing leads to negative emotion. Negative emotion is, it gets often comes under the rubric of mental illness. Is not a mental illness, but because of the way we define mental health is basically just happiness, anxiety, stress, these things which are important for improvement. These are the things that we don't have now. I try to tell my students, failure is good, because, okay, while you're at university, this is the time where you can fail at your essays, because when you fail, you see where you went wrong. But if you're always getting top marks, you don't really see where you can improve. It's only by going through a period of failure, a period of struggle, that you can actually improve and become a better scholar. We've lost that, I think. And you're totally right, Lady of Shalott. Yes, I would vote for this party. I really hope it has this name as well, Spuzzfoot. Maybe it could have Clint Eastwood, from Gran Torino as the mascot or something. Yeah, more of these coming. Indeed, I agree. Sneeze, you lose. Johnny the Great. We have outsourced our intelligence to technology, and our phones are a surrogate memory. People know nothing of themselves. Yeah, and I'm aware, as a researcher, I study history. I'm conscious of the fact I'm not as good a historian as those who've come before me, because I can just go online and look at any digitized document I want. I'm also living in an era where we have the previous scholarship, so I know what's already out there in the field. Many of these individuals in the Victorian era, for example, there wasn't a field of early modern history. They were finding the sources themselves and cataloging them and discussing them. And then in the early 20th century, you start having the historical method being really applied to sources and people finding sources, and not just being able to go online, but going to libraries and working through archives where things hadn't been registered yet. These people were great historians. They found things which, with my skill set from university, I wouldn't necessarily have the ability to do, not as well as they did. That's to their credit, but the cost of the ease and immediacy of technology is that we become less skilled at these sorts of things, and it's a shame. I think, on the other hand, though, that a strength from a research point of view is that people in the past probably couldn't have done the kind of streaming that you get today, because they wouldn't have had the access to as much information and thus as many subject areas as we do today. I don't think a historian in the past could have jumped from a study of Odin to Bob Dylan to the Sensible Center to a reading of The Princess and the Goblin. This is only possible because of these technologies. I'm not saying that makes it therefore a better deal, but it is something that we all enjoy here, and I find it good because it means I can explore so many different things as well, and expand my horizon in a way that maybe I couldn't if I was just focused on one area really closely. Lady of Shlott. Watched an old drama from the 70s recently. The scenes were up to 10 minutes long. You'll not find scenes like that in a modern drama. People no longer have the attention span. Or look at interviews. If you look at interviews from the 70s and so on, okay, some of them were kind of trashy, but many of them were very serious dialogues on kind of a high level. The best we've got today is somebody like Louis Theroux, who all he can do is really ask kind of in a naive way leading questions, whereas these people were having a conversation on significant ideas. It's really it's really a change, isn't it? The center of Plato's circle. Yes. This sounds like the beginning of a film, Snoozy Loos. I can see it in the trailer now. The middle way, the middle path, the independent, the sensible one.
I am the center.
You see, it's just going to be great. I can see it now. Okay, well, I'll go a little bit longer. I've got to get to bed soon. Keep them coming. We should just, on one day, we should just go into the UO chat and just bombard all these ideas in there. It'll be good fun. Let's see. Oh, it has, and it's a detrimental thing. But the other side of it, another thing we have to remember, is in the past, although there would have been this kind of more common sense, and people probably were more shrewd, most people didn't go to university. Most people didn't get involved in education. Most people didn't spend their times engaged in political and philosophical and theological discussion. It was only people who were really intelligent. It was a small group. Today, all the people are getting involved, regardless of how much education they've got, but also just their natural intelligence. So we've reached this point where we've also expanded the conversation to include people who wouldn't have been included in the past as well, combined with the technology. It's not a great recipe, is it? Oh, yes. AM, he does great streams, Apostolic Majesty. You should check his channel out. As a reminder, he will be on Tuesday to discuss the adaptation, Peter Jackson's adaptations of The Lord of the Rings. It should be good fun. And he'll be on again, I think, in a couple of weeks, because some of you may have seen me and Apostolic Majesty did a stream on Breaking Bad. We only got halfway through the series, so we're going to do another stream in a couple of weeks on the second half of Breaking Bad. I'm looking forward to it. We're going to be talking about Mike a bit, and we'll include El Camino, Todd, everybody's favorite character, Todd, Uncle Jack. Oh, it's going to be great. Oh, go on. I have to play the clip, of course.
Explain yourself.
Wrong clip.
Now, say my name.
Apostolic Majesty.
You're goddamn right.
Of course, we will be talking about Huel as well. Everybody loves Huel. Better fuel Huel. That's true as well. We live in an illusory reality of our own making. That's the thing. It wasn't even imposed on us by the machines. Let's see. I'm getting towards the end of these comments. I raised you up. I didn't drag you up, party. Yes. Yes, the middle, the mean, the center of the earth to the center of the sky. There am I. Yes, this is our slogan, the radical center. Yeah, well, these days you can just say you're taking a revisionist approach. You're decolonizing or taking an intersectional approach to a previous issue. So it's all, you can quite easily do a new interpretation of something. It's very noticeable amongst students, the tendency to go towards these sorts of approaches now. Great. Well, I think that's us. 3 hours and 3 minutes. It's been a hell of a ride. I very much enjoyed it. I hope you have too. If you've liked this stream, please like and subscribe. Consider becoming a member for just a couple of quid a month. Makes a big difference. And if you've got any thoughts, I want to hear them. This is just some proposals about the sensible center, the radical center. And I'd like to hear what you have to say. So if you've got any further thoughts, put them in the comments below. And I'll look forward to reading them. In the meantime, just a reminder that on Monday, I'll be on Praise the Follies channel, discussing Lord of the Rings with him, as always. Then after that, on Tuesday, I'll be joined by Black Horse and Apostolic Majesty for a discussion of Peter Jackson's The Lord of the Rings trilogy. And then we'll have something else later in the week, on the Saturday too, probably. And yeah, remember, three videos a week. Amazing Advent before Christmas. I look forward to seeing you all then. I'm going to lead us out with the demo that I played at the beginning by Higher Love. I'll put his link in the description later. Been playing this last few shows. I really enjoy it. I love his work. He's a great guy. You should all check out his music. It's great. But until next time, God bless you all. I wish every blessing upon you. Goodbye.